William Jefferson Clinton is the first American president to have attended family therapy sessions. Now he talks the language of healing to America and to the world. But is it a serious prescription? Can the Clintons, man and wife, really reform a democracy where money has talked so loud for so long? Can they reconcile an insular, isolationist culture with the heritage of intervention and the concept of the superpower? Will Bill be another Roosevelt or just another fuzzy baby boomer? Welcome to States of America. Tonight in Washington, I hope to scrutinize the new Clinton presidency, which promises a kickstart to a very stalled American dream. I've been most fortunate with my guests. Gary Hart, a distinguished former senator and twice himself a presidential candidate, might with better fortune have been sitting where Mr. Clinton now sits. Betsy Wright was one of the president's campaign managers and was for 12 years his chief of staff in Arkansas. She is a true FOB, or in the Washington vernacular, a friend of Bill's. And Vin Weber is one of the youngest men ever elected to Congress, where he worked for 12 years on the Republican side of the aisle and was widely considered one of the keenest conservative political minds. Perhaps he, too, is readying a bid for the White House. Gentlemen and ma'am, thank you very much for joining me. There was something very odd about the opening weeks of the presidency. First, there was that encounter group session at Camp David, his first retreat, where he said to everyone present, all his cabinet officers, let's all confide something about each other. I, for example, was too fat when I was at school and felt bad about it. Everyone, you know, relate and tell something bad about themselves and get in touch with your feelings. And then made his first, if you will, campaign and issue of principle confrontation, that of the sex life of soldiers, sailors, and airmen. Did this strike any of you as a rum start to the proceedings?
Not from a Republican standpoint. It was a wonderful start to the proceedings. But I just thought it started out pretty silly, and I don't know about his group encounter session with the prospective cabinet. But for a candidate who had really done well because of the perception, correct or incorrect, that Republicans were narrowly focused on a social agenda, to initiate his administration with a narrow issue on the social agenda was just not very smart, and I don't think it served him well.
The first couple of weeks were very rocky, but I think the reality of it is to make the transition from campaign personnel to government personnel, and in fact the transition from campaign to governing is much more different than many people who have only worked in campaigns realize. And he began with a new team of people who had not worked together before, most of which had never worked with him on a daily basis before. And what you call an encounter session was a getting to know each other outside of the immediate pressures that began hitting them. I think that the questions of self-introspection were not his idea. I think that some facilitator came and thought that that was a great idea.
A facilitator?
Yes, but Bill Clinton doesn't think that's a bad idea. I mean, he likes people talking about themselves. This is a new thing in his life. He didn't like talking about himself until his brother's drug addiction came to light, and the entire family began searching for the base reasons for this, and he too went into a period of introspection.
We'd had 12 years of deferred lot of social issues that both President Reagan and President Bush refused to address. One of those was the question of the role of gays in our national life at all levels. And anytime you keep the stopper on a boiling kettle, whoever takes the stopper off is going to get burned. And that, I think, it's to President Clinton's credit that he addressed these issues, some of these issues in his campaign, and to his credit that he attempted to do something about many of them all at once, abortion and gays in the military and a variety of other things. It turns out that people in the media like to focus on these issues rather than the end of the Cold War, rather than the internationalization of our economy, rather than what I would call the real structural problems. And
well, one didn't have much choice but to focus on an issue that the president appeared to have chosen. I mean, I suppose I want to move it up a bit to make it
but he chose that along with a whole list of other issues.
Sure, but I mean...
And it was emphasized in part because of the generational change that was being tested by the media, which is that he is a president who did not himself serve in the military, about which a lot was made during the campaign because of his opposition to the policies in the Vietnam War.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I wanted to move the subject up a little notch and make it, as it were, an issue of courage. When Ronald Reagan took the oath, or when George Bush took the oath, everyone could see straight away they had an instinct for being called Commander-in-Chief. Some might have thought they overdid it. Nonetheless, by taking that oath, Bill Clinton became Commander-in-Chief. He then seemed to deal with the armed forces rather as if they were another lobby or another group to be dealt with, pleased, differences split with them, and so on. Do you copy what I'm saying?
I don't. I think there were interpreters or translators that tried to make that point. It didn't come across that way to me, but I'm just an ordinary citizen.
Well, the policy changes that this president is proposing, some of which would be proposed by a president of either party, and I'm thinking there of defense spending levels, but are going to put the military through a traumatic experience. I mean, we're still debating the question of gays in the military, but most people seem to think that's a profound change in the culture of the military. Maybe it's justifiable. I'm not for it, but it's a change, and the dramatic drawdown of the defense budget is going to put the whole system through the ringer, if you will. And so the question is, at the end of this process, are we going to have a military that's capable of doing what needs to be done in the 1990s or not? And as Senator Hart has already pointed out, or at least alluded to, the military is going to have a different function in the post-Cold War era. To be sure, it's something we should talk about. But if we're simply going to have a demoralized military, that's not good for this country. And that's the context in which candidate Clinton had to address his own lack of military background, which is the same as my lack of military background. But I think it's a legitimate concern on the parts of people who are wondering if we're going to have an effective military.
But let me put to you three issues of principle that came up as campaign pledges that would have been in the old days described as toughness issues, strength issues, peace through strength issues even, requiring decision and firmness. Haiti, Bosnia, and the broadening of the military to reflect, as it were, the society from which it recruits. And there's been nothing heard of either of these three promises. They've all, that's to say, they've all three been badly fudged in the early months of the presidency. Does that not make one wonder who's in charge of the clattering train?
What was the promise on Bosnia? I missed it.
Promise on Bosnia was not to stand by and let Serbia take over Bosnia and expel the Muslim population by force. In fact, indeed, George Bush said it was irresponsible. It was flirting with the suggestion of the use of force and was roundly told, no, well, that's what we mean. We mean that we can't let that happen. Now they have let it happen. The same pledge was made about the refugees from Haiti who are, as we speak, drowning in the surf of Florida, and that they would not be treated as refuse. And they are, again, being treated as refuse. And then there was a pledge to quite a large community that had also, perhaps coincidentally, unlike the Haitians or the Bosnians, raised quite a lot of money for the campaign, the homosexual community, who are now being told, well, it's lost in committee somewhere. Now, this isn't confidence-inspiring, is it?
As the president's critic at this table, anyway, I'd give him the benefit of the doubt on a couple of those, that being the gays in the military issue and the Bosnia issue. I mean, all of us who've run for office understand, you know, you're forced, whether you want to or not, to take positions on everything in the course of a campaign. Everything. You have no choice. And then you get into office and you sometimes realize that despite your best efforts, you weren't fully aware of the circumstances. So I don't fault him necessarily for a little backtracking on Bosnia.
Isn't that something any Democrat could say? Let me challenge you.
Sure. I think he'd say. All I'd say is the one that is really seems to me to be worthy of criticism is Haiti. There's nothing, in my view, that the president could have learned subsequent to the election about Haiti that he didn't know when he made that promise. And I was critical of President Bush for his treatment of the Haitians. I think that is the one of those three decisions that we ought to look at and say, was this just a cynical campaign pledge? Why, I mean, what could you possibly have learned that caused you to back away from that, given the tremendous human toll of your subsequent decision?
Well, are you going to be out-radicaled by Congressman Weber, Senator?
Not at all, but I'm not sure what profitably can be added to what he said. Particularly the first, having been through the experience, one is called upon at least, if not to make a policy declaration, at least to make some philosophical or personal sentiment about how you feel about things. And quite often translating those sentiments to actual concrete policy turns out to be much, much harder than one thought.
Well then, can I rephrase it slightly for you, Betsy, right? Is this the character question that you had to spend so much time on in the campaign coming back again in office?
It is not. I think that we must recognize the difference between a stated goal and implementation, and particularly when you're dealing with the military, you have a very well entrenched traditional industry, and it takes a while to shift it. And we are watching an evolution of the function of our military. Unlike the congressman, I'm not at all worried about the strength that our military will have under a Clinton administration with the cutbacks, because I know how committed he is to a strong military that's appropriate for this day and age. But you don't just say, I want to do it. You must move and change major institutions in our society, and the military is one that, quite rightly, is not quick to change.
But it's my understanding that it's only really some of the more labor-intensive bits of the armed services that are being cut back. I mean, if you look at it as an absolute budget number, the current proposal is one it's thinkable a Bush-Quayle administration could have asked Congress to endorse in billions. Am I mistaken?
The budget number that they've asked for?
Yes.
It's
thinkable that if you've been returned, that's the sort of figure you'd be playing with Congress.
I think it's somewhat below. There's no argument, though, that a Bush administration would have drawn down the military budget as well. And no one looks at the end of the Cold War and says that doesn't change any of the military realities in the world. But there are a couple of questions. One is, how far do you go? And I do think the Clinton budget goes somewhat further than President Bush would want to go. And the second is, what does the Congress then do to that budget? I could even say comfortably, I think you could go to the Clinton number on defense, provided you don't let Congress decide the priorities in terms of domestic political considerations, but really addressing what might be our new national security considerations. Unfortunately, in a democracy, things are not going to work that way.
Okay, isn't this, though, the kind of rhetoric that you get when party allegiance is a fairly vestigial thing in people's lives? I mean, there's been a considerable decline in the way people identify and register as committed members of parties, hasn't there?
Well, I think the decline of the parties is a serious problem, and I'm not sure that you can attribute it just to any one cause, but certainly at the height of Perot's popularity in the spring and early summer, or late spring, let's say, of 1992, 70% of the American people told, I believe, the Wall Street Journal that they had no confidence in either political party. That's a remarkable thing, and it's a very bad thing for our system of democracy.
Betsy Wright, do you think that's fair? Does the Democratic Party not still champion the poor and the underprivileged?
It does, but I don't think there's the kind of communication between the party and the people that it champions that there used to be or needs to be. I'm a strong advocate of political parties. I think they've served this country well in its history, and basically they have served it by keeping stuff out of the back rooms, and I think that what we need is a new concept of political parties and what they can be in the 90s. I think that they can be critical to cutting back on the amount of money needed and spent in campaigns and economizing in campaigns. I think that they should take a role of holding their own office holders accountable for performance and connections to the people. I am an advocate of reform of the parties, but I am very strongly an advocate of re-strengthening the parties, both of them, because we need each other in this country to keep each other more focused.
Well, isn't that, in fact, quite just what a lot of people fear? When they look at Washington, they think actually it's a one-party state where the two parties wash each other's hands. If you remember, the great scandal of the 80s was the savings and loan debacle for which everyone is still paying. It couldn't have been a more bipartisan.
They're looking at other kinds of interest groups.
There's a real important distinction to make there. Yes, Washington should be criticized for policies which strengthen incumbency without regard to party. But that's not the same as saying the two parties are strengthening each other. We have seen a decline of parties partly because incumbents of both parties have strengthened themselves to the point that they don't need parties. I agree very much with Betsy. I want to see parties hold their elected officials considerably more accountable than they do today. But that means you have to have stronger parties and, in a sense, weaker incumbents.
What about the idea of the imperial presidency, that the president himself very, very quickly becomes insulated from all these domestic and popular pressures, that he can run a state within a state?
I don't think so. I think the society generally in the country has gotten to be bigger and more complex, and clearly much more complicated than it was 100 or even 50 years ago, or 20 years ago for that matter.
But seeing President Clinton doing his town meetings and trying, which of course we know he's trying to do an end run around the press and speak to people directly.
Right.
Isn't there something so slightly plaintive, don't you feel, when he gets out on the stage and says, please, don't lose touch with me.
Yes.
I'm being drawn into the White House and away from my roots.
But that's that's a product of a lot of factors, not the least of which is we tend to take shots at our leaders over here, so they have to be protected. Protection gets into motorcades and isolation in the White House, and I think he's trying desperately to break out of that.
Well, you're a friend of Bill's. I mean, do you feel that he's in any danger of getting cut off from the folk from whence he came?
I don't, because he is determined that he won't be, and he's very sensitive about it. This is a man who is addicted to meeting new people, every day, and he will have to find ways to constantly be interacting with people. I do want to take issue with you saying he doesn't end run around the press and goes directly to the people. He goes directly to the people as well as talking to the press.
That's a very good point on which to take our break, which will be short, after which we'll return to the Clintons and to their works. Join us. Welcome back to States of America and to Washington, where we're debating the Clinton presidency. I thought in this segment we might try and forget we were in Washington, in fact, and transcend our sort of co-membership in the political journalistic class and just think about what America is up against as a standard of comparison. I mean, consider the fact that it's become a detonation, a net detonation, on really quite a colossal scale. Look at the lost generation of alienated American youth. At the decay and collapse of the cities, at the apparent loss of competitive edge in economic innovation. These are pretty awesome things, are they not, Betsy Wright? Do you think the president really wakes up every morning aware of this?
Oh, I think he wakes up. I think he goes to sleep aware of it. And I also think that we are at a point of both optimism in our country and opportunity to reverse that cynicism, to reverse that decay that we haven't had for a long time. There is a spirit of hope across this country. It is probably both the greatest challenge and the greatest enemy that Bill Clinton has, is fulfilling the expectations of that hope. But it has given us a spirit in this country that's wonderful.
But there's the small town called Hope, which, I mean, you'll pardon me for saying we've heard about before. And then there are quite big towns like Los Angeles and New York and Chicago, where there's basically racial and social mayhem impending. I mean, how long are you going to say that it's a matter of the spirit in which you approach it? What are you going to do?
I contend that there is a spirit of hope in those places right now also. And there is a sense that we may get our act together in this country that hasn't been there in a long time.
I feel like that's you,
The
Senator?
major difference, again, is the end of the Cold War. Our priorities in this country for half a century were oriented towards stopping communism. And our highest priority was to finance that effort. And that necessarily detracted politically and economically from the domestic agenda, if you will, both social agenda and economic agenda. I am a student of Arthur Schlesinger Jr.'s thesis of cycles of American history. We have deferred for at least one cycle, if not two, major reforms in our society, and many of them have resulted in the consequences you've stated. President Clinton's challenge now isn't the gays in the military, with all due respect to him and them. His issue is to restructure the fundamental structures of this country, its military structures, its financial structures, its social structures.
Well, let me press you.
And no one has had that, as no one's had that challenge since Franklin Roosevelt. And so he's got to think big, very, very big.
Well, can I press you to give, either of you, any of you, actually I should perhaps concentrate on the two Democrats with your permission,
I'm just listening.
for the moment. Could I press you just to give a shining instance of the process begun?
Oh, the process that's begun is
You'll have to pardon
the president's economic package, which attacks both the deficit and creation of new jobs simultaneously.
You didn't mean to say it attacked the creation of new jobs, I know. So
No. Attacks, thank you very much.
That'd be
It's
my
right in there with process. Attacks the deficit and would create new jobs and stimulate the economy simultaneously. And also trying to prepare a major health care reform in this country. You can only move in a big way on so many fronts, and those are very big fronts. And they happen to be ones that I think will go right to the core of the problems creating our cynicism and our decay.
Talking of cynicism, you must be feeling fairly embittered, Congressman, because after all, back in the fall, I remember you saying, and you and your confrere, the economy is about to go into a bit of an upswing, probably maybe in time for November, and Bill Clinton will raise taxes on the middle class. Now, actually, around January, the economy went into a bit of an upswing, and then President Clinton said he'd raise taxes on the middle class. Very, very sad for you to have to watch this as a spectator.
Well, yes. But on the other hand, I also was one who said for 4 years of the Bush administration we needed to be doing more to maximize economic growth rates. So I criticized President Clinton for saying that our economy was the worst since the Depression, which was a massive, massive exaggeration. But clearly we could do better than we've been doing the last 4 years. I don't argue that. I would simply argue still an economic program that is premised, much as your question was, on the notion that the American economy is a basket case, is simply based on a false foundation. During the much despised 1980s, the United States took the lead in just about every new technology coming online. #1 in cellular telephones, #1 in fiber optics, #1 in computers, #1 in computer chips. I don't say this is the end-all of the discussion, but the notion that we'd simply slipped into the bog in the 80s is simply not true. The more important question, in my view, is why, not just in the 80s, but if you track social indicators back to the early 1960s, why haven't we been successful in dealing with the problems of those people that we talked about in East LA or any of the other poor neighborhoods in the country, despite spending trillions of dollars through programs put on the books in the 1960s at the time of the Great Society?
Well, question for you then, Senator.
Well,
what about the
I think those programs did a lot of good. I think the conditions in LA would be a lot worse today without them. To fault the programs for not solving every social ill misses the point. Without those programs, without some social commitment to justice, economic and legal justice in this country, I think this country would have gone into flames as it started to do in '68. Those programs like that gave people hope and promise. They didn't solve everybody's problems. Now the question is, what do we do now? The supply side experiment has failed, I think, at the cost of $3 trillion in debt since it was tried. And now we've got to go back to try some other things. I think it's a mixed economy of government intervention and management and stimulation of the private sector.
But can I
we have a cabinet now that has as many millionaires in it as Bush's did and as Reagan's did. We have a cabinet composed of people who have been very largely insulated from all of this, who are part of the, let's say, the more fortunate, if not the more skillful class. And by what right do they presume to say that they feel the pain they talk about?
John Kennedy was a rich man. Franklin Roosevelt was a rich man. That's got nothing to do with it. You don't have to be impoverished to understand poverty.
Or to love people. And that's one of the big differences between the Democrats he named and the Republicans that we've had most recently. And certainly I think it's one of the strongest.
Democrats like people, Republicans don't.
No,
that's pretty close.
It is a genuine love for people. I mean, with all due respect to your gentleness here, what you just said in laying out the technological advances is my nightmare as a Democrat, because it absolutely ignores the declining quality of life for the individuals in this country by the millions, which occurred during that period of time. And a nation that can be proud of technological advances and not care about what's happening to the working force and the quality of life that people are living is a sick nation.
This is my concern.
Congressman, your chance to show you're a people person.
As long as this is my concern about the Democrats. When I describe becoming #1 in computers, fiber optics, cellular telephones, computer chips, it somehow is lost on my Democrat friends that all those things that turned into millions of jobs for people. That's how you create jobs. This administration does not seem to understand it. And Betsy, it doesn't surprise me that it would be sort of lost on you, almost terrifying to you that we would talk about
this administration
doing
does
those
understand
things
it.
that create jobs for people.
This administration does understand it. But this administration measures the economic health based not only on those factors, but also on what is happening to our people. And you left it at those technological advances and did not go and look at what has happened to the declining incomes of the American people, the abilities to be covered by health insurance. I don't think that you can define the American economy without doing both.
I think that you should do both as well. But again, back to the point I was going to make to Gary a few minutes ago, what are we seeing new out of this administration to attack these problems? I'm not arguing, Gary, back to your point, that spending money on social programs is per se a bad thing. Maybe some Republicans would. That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying we've got a 30-year experiment, at least, that we can look at, and certainly nobody is going to say that those programs have been monumentally successful. Now, let's put aside the question of levels of spending for a minute, about which I think can become a distraction. Shouldn't we be talking about at least changing the way that those programs deliver those services?
And we
I'm
are.
not seeing
And,
it.
oh, yes,
All I'm
we.
seeing
Oh, yes.
is
Well, then
proposals
look.
for more spending and more taxes.
Then
I
you
think
just
I may have to
look and read and watch.
recover the authority of the chair here just for a second. Don't I remember in the not just the closing but the opening stages of the campaign that it was Governor Clinton, as he then was, who was rather more strident than the Republican Party about the need to get the poor people to pull up their socks and generally pull their weight, and welfare reform, and in fact saying, I remember this very clearly, in the last month of their campaign, those who do not work should not eat. One of St. Paul's harsher statements later elaborated by Lenin into a remark for the class war. This didn't strike me as the particularly, shall we say,
something
soggy
that
about
happened
the
only
poor.
in the campaign. Bill Clinton has long been an advocate of welfare reform, and those programs were enormously successful. What failed about those programs was our inability to adapt them to a changing world of where the recipients got information, to the basic structures that were changing in their communities. And welfare reform is a prime example of how you take those programs and adapt them to the current lives that people are living. And we will see a lot more of them. And Bill Clinton will exhibit leadership with both the Democrats and the Republicans in Congress to make those changes.
But really, since you were taking the high moral line about the lives of the poor and so forth, you remember when Lady Bracknell says in The Importance of Being Earnest, what's the use of the poor people if they don't set a good example? No one says in America that rich people have to lead exemplary lives and prove that they've earned their money and be invigilated by sociologists and checked
Christopher,
off.
I wasn't talking about the poor people. I was talking about the middle class with declining incomes and declining quality of life and declining health coverage. I mean, we were even losing our middle class during that.
Here's my chance to ask you.
It's not true.
Here's my chance to ask you: in what bracket does the middle class exist? Financial income bracket in the democratic imagination now, because there really is some difficulty we're all finding in getting this definition. You can make it a ballpark bracket, but I would be grateful.
I'm going to back off from doing that.
It's a sociological question. What, profiting what? I mean, so what? It's whatever the demographers define as...
Well, it was, excuse me, Senator, it was a fiscal question in the election. It was, we won't raise your taxes if you're middle class, which must mean there's a median of income.
The real definition of middle class is if you believe that you can move up. If you believe you can move up, you're middle class in this country, just about wherever your income falls. The people that are not middle class are those that are sort of locked in a poverty.
When I was growing up.
Interesting definition.
Yes, the definition when I was growing up was that you were terrified of falling back.
No, I think...
You could feel the proles snapping at your heel.
I don't think, by the way, you disagree with it if you think about it. The people that are really not middle class in this country are people that are in such despair they don't think they can ever move from where they are. If someone has hope that through some kind of effort they can better themselves economically, they really adapt to a whole range of middle-class attitudes and cultural norms in this country. And that is a better definition of middle class than $20,000 a year income, which is where the Clinton people seem to put it, it seems to me.
But unlike quite a lot of other developed capitalist countries, such as Japan, Germany, even Britain, which is relatively poor compared to the United States, the United States appears to have a permanent underclass. A class of people who don't vote, can barely read, as you say, find it very difficult to move, to be mobile in labor, are usually of a slightly darker skin than the majority of the population, and who are very combustible socially, or at least are believed to be, if not socially, then in criminal terms, often one by one or group by group, gang by gang. Now, why should it be assumed, as it seems to be in the political discourse that I hear, that that's somehow a given fact? I don't hear any talk about changing that at all.
Well, that's wrong. I mean, if your description is accurate, that's very, very wrong.
You mean it would be an awful thing to be true, or it's wrong of me to say so?
The former.
The former, good.
I think you're wrong, though, say so. I think there is a debate about what to do with the so-called underclass.
Very much so. And throughout the campaign, one of the things that Bill Clinton talked about was to make it a country where every person could be everything that he or she wanted to be.
But with respect, Ronald Reagan was capable of saying that and did.
Well, Bill Clinton has been president a very short...
That's how you do it.
And it's also really believing it. And Bill Clinton has a long time record with the Governors Association of outlining what these barriers are, which have to do with the breakdown of community and the breakdown of family and the new role that schools play and the declining health of our children, and the stopping the teen pregnancy, stopping the AIDS threat that's now going on with so many young people in those communities you just described.
Congressman Weber's party, at any rate, took the view that probably democratic solutions had helped to create that. I mean, all the 60s immorality and dissolution of traditional ties was responsible for the culture of poverty. Do you take that view?
Well, I think we take the view that social welfare programs, well-intentioned, did not succeed and had some negative consequences. And you don't need to look only at Republicans. Look back at the things that Senator Moynihan was talking about as far back as the 1960s. Look, neither party comes to this debate with a whole lot to brag about, in my view. If I'm sort of forced to defend my party, I'm going to be quick to attack the Democrats as a good strategy. But my point would be, neither party, in my view, has dealt very effectively with the problems of the poor for a long time. I'll start by taking my hat off to the people in the 60s that devised the Great Society, because they clearly cared about it and they thought a whole deal about it. I don't think many people in either party have invested similar amounts of intellectual energy in the problems of the poor since then, and that's my concern.
Spoken like a statesman.
Well, I think it's true.
It is true.
But I liked the way that you said it would be wrong earlier, and I want you to elaborate about that, if you would.
If we give up, I mean, if regardless of party, if as a nation we give up on the 20% who are below the standard of any decent standard of living.
Would you rate it as 20%?
Well, I don't know. Pick a number, whatever the number is. If it's 3%, if we give up as a society and a country, then we demean ourselves, and that corrodes our spirit in a whole lot of ways that none of us are. I mean, the fact that we have treated, I don't want to get on an Oscar soapbox here, but the way we've treated the Native Americans in this country for a couple of hundred years, the fact we didn't address fundamental racism until 20 or 30 years ago, I think that's corrosive. I think it gets into the soul of a society. And the issue of justice, the older I get anyway, is the central issue of a society. And we as Democrats criticize our opponents because we think, or we say that we think, they don't care. They don't evidence that commitment to justice.
Relatively...
We fumble, we enact programs, people have to pay tax dollars. But as Franklin Roosevelt said, there's a different scale for the warm-hearted versus the cold-hearted. And that's what it's all about.
I was going to give you 20 seconds to reply to that, Congressman, but I decided it would be unfair. And anyway, the chill wind of economic reality blows on us too, and we have to take another break. I've got two real corking subjects when we come back, which, like General MacArthur, we certainly shall. Join us. Welcome back to States of America, where I'm scrutinizing the Clinton presidency with Gary Hart, Betsy Wright, and Vin Weber. I thought we might talk about the other kinds of division in America. We've talked about the social and racial ones a bit, but there's a cultural divide, or series of divisions more properly. Some call it a return to ghettoization, people defining themselves as gay American, let's say, or Spanish American, or African American, and where therefore all politics has to take account of this. I was very struck by the way that President Clinton, when he was appointing his cabinet, said, "I'm against bean counting," as he called it, while apparently being quite a deft little counter of beans and making sure there was something for everybody. Is this, do you think, the American way? Do you think it's wise to have a spoils system of this sort, Congressman?
You can overstate the change here. I mean, there's been a certain amount of what you might call bean counting for a long time in politics. I do think that they've taken it to an extreme in this administration, but past administrations, particularly in the Democratic Party, which has been a more coalition-building party than the Republicans, you know, there are a certain number of seats in various parts of government for Irishmen and for Jews and for Italians, and by and large, we all thought of that as pretty good. That's the way that people moved out of the lower class or underclass and established role models to move up in society. The question is, how rigorously do you apply that model? Some of us look at the Clinton administration. We say a bit too rigorously. If we're going to try to directly mirror the population without regard to merit, you're going to end up with some people who should be able to serve in government thrown aside because they're white males with an Anglo-Saxon background.
In other words, it's a question not of recognizing that people are such a thing.
It's a matter of degree.
As of denominating them.
It's a matter of degree. Government should make some kind of an effort to include people that have been left out of society. How rigorously do you do that? And how many people that are of great ability are you going to exclude from government because they are not female or Hispanic or black? That's the question.
I don't think you need me to rephrase the question, do you, Betsy?
No, I don't. We have had 12 years now of very rigorous condescension about minorities and women in this country from the leadership in the White House. And we have a lot of ground to make up. Breaking new ground for power positions for women and minorities is not easy. And it is not done without clumsy, awkward stumbling, and we have seen some of that. The issue is not bean counting. The issue is not what kinds of beans are in the pot. The issue is whether you consider all kinds of people for all kinds of leadership positions. And diversity, I think we had a really hard time getting the American people on course of understanding what diversity was because of some of the awkward stumbling. This is not an easy thing to do. And a determination to demonstrate that among the best minds in this country on all issues are white men as well as women and minorities is not easy. And I commend the President for taking the risk and making the effort, even for the stumbling that has occurred, particularly in the Attorney General position.
Now, perhaps as an Anglo-Saxon, which is after all the origin of Wasbury, I mean, I'm in some position to say this. If I look at Vernon Jordan, who's black American, African American, or Ron Brown, black American, African American, two distinguished Clinton appointments, and at Zoe Baird, who's a woman, what I really see is what they have in common that I don't have in common with them, and it's not my skin color or my sex, it's the fact that I'm not a member of the class of corporate lobbyists and lawyers. I mean, in other words, I want to ask you the question, pluralism for whom? Who's supposed to be impressed by this kind of allocation of seating around the cabinet table? Well,
I mean, you're also going to have to look at more members of the cabinet with Henry Cisneros and with Donna Shalala and Secretary Pena. I mean, rich people are a part of this society too, and they are not monolithic either.
This is not exactly the rhetoric we heard out of the Democrats the last 12 years.
No, but they've been the only ones recognized, and so for you to come back and say, well, you've got some too, we have a lot of people who aren't rich also, and again, that's diversity, and you're only picking one piece of it, and it's the totality of it. I mean, listen, no one woman represents all women in this country. In fact, women will not be equal in this country until it is okay for us to be different from each other. And we have to recognize that among ourselves too. So no one woman selected as Attorney General or as Secretary of Energy is like all women. But they do demonstrate that among the experts and leaders in this country in those areas are women.
Senator, you looked as if you were about to break in there.
No,
Doesn't strike you as odd that there are 13 millionaires, I believe it's 13 millionaires in the cabinet?
I think it's kind of an irrelevant debate, but it is somewhat important how one got to be a millionaire. If you inherited it, generally you have one set of views. If you had to earn it and work for it, you probably, and you started at a fairly low level, you probably have a different set of views. But I don't know what that proves regarding anything we're talking about here.
Well, while we're staying with large sums of money, but moving quite abruptly to another subject, it's been announced that anything between 1.7 and, according to some figures, 3.2 billion American dollars are going to go to the restitution of the former Soviet Union, in particular to Russia. And it also seems that President Clinton, though he very often wants to be on both sides of many questions and to split the difference, is of absolutely one mind on one thing, which is that Boris Yeltsin is, in a sense, his man. Do you think we've overinvested, Senator Hart, in the future of one foreign politician?
Perhaps we have. The two observations I would make is, first of all, having been back and forth to the former Soviet Union and Russia a lot, I can remember 3 or 4 years in which people said, will Gorbachev succeed? And we personalized this revolution. I think we're making, to a degree, the same mistake with Boris Yeltsin. I think it would be wrong to put all of our eggs in one basket, if you will. He is the dominant Reform Democrat. There is no one else on the horizon that I know of to replace him, and therefore he deserves our support. But we shouldn't be so fixated on him that we miss the point that a fundamental revolution is occurring in Russia and will continue to occur for 20 or 30 years. It's not going to be solved tomorrow. The second thing I would say is, I think there are a variety of ways, and I hope President Clinton will adopt them eventually, soon, to help the Russians and the Commonwealth states that are, if you will, off budget. For example, a system of loan guarantees. We could create a program, something similar to our so-called Fannie Mae or Ginnie Mae, which would create new financing mechanisms for Western corporations and American corporations investing in infrastructure projects in Russia that would not impact on the federal budget. Deferred taxation on income received over there. Elimination of the last vestiges of COCOM, which is a restriction on technology transfer, which some of us have been trying to get.
I don't want to cut you short on this, Senator, but I don't want it to become too long of a wish list, as it were. I mean, my question is still,
my point is,
do you think that this is congruent with what appears to be a very heavily weighted insistence on the political character and survival of Boris Yeltsin?
Probably too much, but on the other hand, there is no one else.
Well, there is a vote coming up, and apparently the only way to vote for or against reform centers around for or against Boris Yeltsin. Because I think President Clinton, in his earlier statements, was very clear to support the reform movement and democracy on behalf of this country. But since that time, a vote has been set, and I think that has a lot to do with the strong support for the man.
It goes to the question, doesn't it, also, of America as a debtor country. After all, the majority of the Russian debt is actually held by Germany, so that a Clinton policy on Russia to succeed must ask other people's money to be spent. So I don't know whether you agree with this, Congressman, but that it returns us to the question of the relationship between the economic and the foreign dimension.
Well, first of all, I think President Clinton's right on target in his handling of Yeltsin. I'm proud of it as an American. I hope my party is supportive when it comes to the Congress, and you have to actually put up the dollars. There are more things that you can do, which is not meant to be critical of the $1.6 billion, but I agree with everything Senator Hart talked about. I also think we need to look hard at trading relationships with those countries. If capitalism is going to take root in Eastern Europe, they're going to have to have someone to sell things to, and we can create markets for them right here, but that, again, impacts on our domestic economy. I think we should do it. I would open up our trading relationships with Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union as quickly and as liberally as we possibly could. But that'll be a debate in itself, I suppose.
One footnote, I think we made a mistake for the last several years of defining democracy in economic terms. That is to say, we've tended, the previous administration particularly, to gauge the progress of democracy in Russia and elsewhere based on their willingness to accept capitalist market economics. Those are two different concepts, frankly. And I think you can have capitalism without having democracy. I don't think you can have democracy without also then having open markets. So I think we ought to put our eggs in the democracy basket, not in the capitalist basket. Because one doesn't, I mean, that doesn't guarantee democracy.
Now, on the issue of democracy, both you gentlemen found in the end the experience of Congress a rather unsatisfying one. Found the word often used in Washington, I think it's leaked into the European press too, is gridlock. In other words, the sense that nothing can get done, you have to spend too much time raising money, that the lobbyists control too much, and so on. Does it depress you that President Clinton seems to rely rather a lot for his congressional management on some of the old committee chairman dinosaurs, on the business as usual?
Well, what choice does he have?
Yeah. I'd love to blame him for that, but I don't think you can hardly fault him for that. I think the Congress has to look itself in the mirror, look it in the face a lot closer. I don't fault this president or the previous one. But the notion of Congress as a full-time, lifelong career is bad for the country, bad for the institution, and I would go a step further and say it's bad for the individuals that are serving there. And I'd be interested in Gary's comments.
I agree.
About it.
I couldn't agree more. My generation, many of us got into politics as an expression of citizen commitment, if you will, part-time, almost idealistic Grecian contribution to your society. But in the course of my 20 years, 15 or 20 years, I saw the whole process become very careerist-oriented in both political parties. Now you have people coming here at the age of 27, 28, and they tilt almost everything towards staying as long as they can in government, and I think that's bad. It's
a question I wanted to generalize a bit to ask Betsy Wright about. It's clear from this discussion and lots of others that are going on in Washington at the moment that an enormous amount is invested in the idea of Clinton's success. And therefore, that if there is a failure, there's a correspondingly huge potential for disillusionment and for cynicism, and perhaps for people really giving up on the democratic idea. Do you feel that danger as you watch the...
Well, first of all, there
action?
isn't going to be a failure. But the real point you're asking is, how will his successes be translated to the American people? And Bill Clinton learned many years ago that you must keep the people informed of the changes you are making as you go along, not after they have happened. And we are seeing a president who is using communications technology and access to the people far beyond that which has been used in the past for that very reason. The success with which he mobilized support of giving his economic plan and proposal a try was one example, but we will soon see an all-out effort on the health care proposal when it is formulated. And this is consistent with the way he governed in Arkansas, is that you take it to the people too, not just the folks that vote in the Congress.
Now, the health care proposal raises the very point I was wanting to come to, which is the question of the status and potency of the First Lady. Some people say that never mind how good a First Lady is, she has to bear in mind not just that she wasn't elected, but that she can't be fired. And thus, a certain decorum has to be expected. Do you think that's a sexist statement?
Oh, I certainly do. People didn't worry about John Kennedy not firing Bobby Kennedy. And that isn't to say that they're not going to...
They prohibited future
that was
presidents
afterwards. But it wasn't because he couldn't fire him. That goes to a question about what their relationship is, and they can differ. And what I wish that people knew about their relationship that I know is the professional respect that they have for each other's roles and responsibilities. And Hillary will be forever mindful that he is the president and it is ultimately his responsibility to make the decisions, and she will try to help him succeed on that. I find that many of the questions about the propriety of her role in a major policy issue like health to be really thinly veiled curiosity on the part of men about this fundamental decision Bill Clinton made to marry a woman this smart and this strong. And that it's really a curiosity about Bill, not about her.
But the curiosity will turn to much more politicized inquisition if her healthcare plan turns out to be a turkey.
Well,
and, then
it will be his healthcare plan. She is directing a task force which will make a recommendation to him. He has always altered her task force recommendations to some degree or another, so he will then make it his, and she will help him with whatever form he takes it forth in. But it will be his healthcare plan, not hers.
Well, that returns us in a way, and perhaps aptly, to where we began, which is on the question of character. And I hope you won't mind if I take advantage of having both you and Senator Hart here to ask this question. During the campaign, you were subjected to a lot of innuendo about the president's sex life. And you, Senator, know what it is like to be accused of being sexually indiscreet when you're trying to run a presidential campaign. Do you think this shows American Puritanism and American hypocrisy, or do you think it shows that one needs a certain type of person to run for the highest office?
No comment on my part.
No comment from the Senator?
Can I comment?
By all means, comment.
I think it shows that the media is no longer respecting in any degree the privacy of people who run for office, and they no longer are able to make real judgments about when a politician's personal life might affect his public performance. And that I think that's terribly unfortunate, whether the politicians involved are Republicans or Democrats.
Very quickly, though, don't you think that Ronald Reagan married a woman more intelligent than himself, and don't you wish you'd known a bit more about how they were getting along?
No, I think you're missing the point here about the issues that came up in the Clinton campaign, far more than Senator Hart's campaigns, though. It laid the groundwork for a generational change, and that any time we were going to be considering a nominee for president of this country who grew up in the 60s...
I have to cut you off, I'm frightfully sorry. It would happen just like this. The sands of time have insensitively run out on us, and I'd like to thank Gary Hart very much, and Betsy Wright, and Vin Weber for shedding light and even a little heat on the Clinton presidency. For now, good night.